The fastest way to discover who truly matters is to remove the one person everyone quietly depends on. Monday mornings at Whitmore Industrial Solutions always began with polished shoes, fresh coffee, and carefully measured smiles. But on this particular morning, the air felt strangely heavier, as though the entire building sensed something had shifted before anyone spoke a single word. Employees gathered inside the executive conference room overlooking downtown Chicago, whispering in cautious voices while the city skyline shimmered behind floor-to-ceiling windows. At exactly 9 a.m., Chairman Charles Whitmore entered with several executives following close behind. Beside him walked his 28-year-old son, Ryan Whitmore, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit that still looked newer than experience itself. Conversations faded instantly. Ethan Walker sat quietly near the center of the room, his leather notebook resting neatly on the polished table. At 39 years old, Ethan had spent 11 years helping build the operations division from little more than scattered spreadsheets and impossible deadlines into one of the company's most respected departments. He never sought attention, never competed for applause, and never reminded anyone how many late nights or weekends he had sacrificed. Most employees simply knew that whenever something went wrong, Ethan somehow found a way to make it right. Chairman Whitmore cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming. Today marks an exciting new chapter for our company." Ryan smiled confidently while several executives exchanged approving nods. Effective immediately, the chairman continued, "Ryan Whitmore will assume leadership of strategic operations." Silence settled across the room. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for their coffee. Ethan remained perfectly still. His name had not been mentioned once, yet everyone understood exactly what had happened. Ryan looked toward Ethan with a smile that felt rehearsed more than earned. "I appreciate everything you've done here," Ryan said. "I'm looking forward to bringing fresh ideas and modern leadership to the department." A few polite claps echoed awkwardly. Before disappearing into the uncomfortable quiet, Ethan slowly closed his notebook, stood up, and offered a calm handshake. "Congratulations," he said simply. There was no bitterness in his voice, no sarcasm, no attempt to embarrass anyone, just quiet dignity. Ryan accepted the handshake, perhaps expecting resistance and finding none. Ethan collected the framed photograph that had rested on his desk for years. It showed his 9-year-old daughter, Lily, smiling with missing front teeth while holding a homemade science fair ribbon. As he walked through the open office carrying only a small cardboard box, conversations stopped one by one. Several co-workers lowered their eyes. Others wanted to speak, but could not find the courage. They knew Ethan had trained most of them, encouraged them through difficult projects, and stayed late countless evenings so younger employees could make it home to their families on time. Yet no one stepped forward. Outside, the cool Lake Michigan breeze drifted between the downtown buildings as Ethan placed the box carefully into the back seat of his aging silver Ford Escape. His phone buzzed. A text from Lily appeared on the screen. "Good luck today, Daddy. You're the smartest person at your company." Ethan stared at the words for a long moment before a gentle smile crossed his face. He typed back only 4 words. "Love you more always." Then he started the engine and drove away without realizing that the decision made inside that conference room had already set invisible consequences into motion, consequences that would quietly begin unfolding before the first week had even come to an end. The next morning arrived with the quiet rhythm Ethan had come to trust long before job titles ever entered his life. The alarm sounded at 6 o'clock, and he was already awake, standing in the small kitchen of his modest suburban home outside Chicago, pouring pancake batter onto an old cast-iron griddle while sunlight slowly filtered through the curtains. The smell of maple syrup drifted through the house, just as light footsteps raced down the hallway. Lily appeared wearing mismatched socks, her backpack hanging awkwardly from one shoulder. "Good morning, Daddy." Ethan smiled as he slid another pancake onto her plate. "Good morning, kiddo. Big math quiz today." She nodded proudly. "I studied everything twice." Ethan chuckled softly. "Then you have already done the hard part." They ate together without rushing, talking about school projects, the stray cat that kept visiting the backyard, and the little sunflower Lily insisted was finally growing taller than the fence. She never asked about the meeting from yesterday. Ethan never volunteered the details. Some burdens, he believed, belonged to adults, not children. As they walked toward his aging Ford Escape, Lily looked up and noticed something different. You are not wearing your work badge. Ethan paused only for a second before opening her door. I guess I will not be needing it anymore. She frowned slightly. Did something happen? He fastened her seat belt carefully before answering. Sometimes life changes plans without asking us first. She looked thoughtful for a moment. Are you sad? Ethan leaned against the door and smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes because it was built on honesty instead of convenience. A little. But being disappointed does not mean giving up. Lily nodded slowly as if storing those words somewhere she could use them years later. After dropping her off at school, Ethan drove across town to a small neighborhood automotive shop owned by his longtime friend, Marcus Bennett. The faded sign above the garage had seen better decades, but inside, the place carried something money could never buy. Trust. Marcus looked up from beneath the hood of an old pickup truck and grinned. You came early. Ethan laughed quietly. I suddenly have a flexible schedule. Marcus wiped his hands on a clean towel before studying his friend's expression. They really did it. Ethan nodded once. They did. Marcus shook his head. 11 years. Ethan simply shrugged. Companies make decisions. People make choices. I cannot control either one. Marcus stared at him in disbelief. You are not even angry. Ethan picked up a wrench from the workbench and began helping without being asked. Anger solves very little. Bills still need to be paid. Lily still needs breakfast tomorrow morning. Across the city, Ryan Whitmore stepped into his new office overlooking the Chicago River. The spacious corner suite had belonged to Ethan only hours earlier, although Ethan had never requested the larger office nor cared much about the view. Ryan admired the expensive furniture before calling his first leadership meeting. We are going to modernize everything, he announced confidently. Some old habits have held this company back for years. Several managers exchanged uncertain glances. They recognized many of the procedures Ryan criticized because Ethan had designed them after years of practical experience solving real problems. No one challenged the new executive. Not because they agreed, but because uncertainty often sounds safer than honesty. While Ryan outlined ambitious changes on digital presentation slides, Ethan tightened bolts beneath the hood of an aging family sedan, humming quietly to himself. One man had inherited authority overnight. The other still carried something that could never be handed down, purchased, or replaced. The steady respect earned one ordinary day at a time. By the end of the first week, the confidence that had filled Ryan Whitmore's office on Monday morning had already begun colliding with reality. Every day seemed to introduce another meeting, another report, another decision that looked simple on paper but refused to cooperate in the real world. Ryan stood before the operations team with a polished presentation glowing behind him. Starting today, he announced, all project approvals will require executive review. We need tighter control and greater efficiency. Several employees exchanged uneasy glances. Samantha Brooks, a senior project coordinator who had worked alongside Ethan for nearly 8 years, cautiously raised her hand. Under the previous system, department managers could approve urgent client requests within 1 hour. If every decision now waits for executive approval, deliveries could be delayed. Ryan smiled politely, but there was impatience beneath the expression. That was the old way. We are building a smarter company. Nobody argued. The meeting ended with quiet nods rather than genuine agreement. 2 days later, the first delay arrived. A manufacturing client requested a simple specification adjustment before production could continue. Under Ethan's process, the revision would have taken less than 30 minutes. Instead, the request moved from one executive inbox to another, waiting for signatures, scheduling, and discussions that produced far more conversation than progress. By Friday afternoon, the client called asking why such a routine request had not been completed. No one offered an answer that sounded convincing. Ryan responded with another meeting. We simply need everyone to adapt, he insisted. Change always creates temporary discomfort. Around the conference table, people wrote notes they already knew would not solve the growing problems. Outside the meeting room, conversations became quieter than usual. Employees who once collaborated freely now hesitated before making even ordinary decisions, afraid of bypassing the new chain of command. Confidence slowly gave way to caution, and caution quietly became hesitation. Meanwhile, Ethan settled naturally into life at Marcus Bennett's garage. The work was different, but the rhythm felt familiar. Every customer who arrived left with more than repaired brakes or tuned engines. They left feeling hurt. An elderly couple thanked Ethan after he noticed a worn tire they had not realized needed replacing. A young delivery driver returned simply to shake his hand after Ethan repaired a minor problem without charging extra labor. Marcus watched all of it with quiet admiration. "You know," he said one afternoon while organizing tools, "people keep coming back because they trust you before they even know your prices." Ethan smiled as he wiped grease from his hands. Most people are not looking for perfection. They are looking for someone who keeps their word. Across town, Chairman Charles Whitmore reviewed the week's performance summary. Numbers that had remained remarkably stable for years suddenly showed unusual fluctuations. Small scheduling delays had multiplied. Customer response times had nearly doubled. Internal approval requests had increased so dramatically that managers spent more time requesting permission than solving problems. Charles frowned as he compared the reports with those from the previous month. "That is strange," he murmured quietly. His executive assistant, Helen Foster, stood nearby holding another folder. She hesitated before speaking. "Sir, several department heads have privately expressed concerns." Charles looked up. "About Ryan?" Helen chose her words carefully. "About the new procedures." The chairman leaned back in silence. He had expected adjustment challenges, but not this pattern. Something deeper seemed to be changing inside the company. Something invisible could not be measured by charts alone. That evening, after finishing another honest day's work, Ethan sat on the front porch beside Lily as the summer sun disappeared beyond the neighborhood trees. She leaned against his shoulder while reading a library book, completely unaware that the quiet peace surrounding their small home stood in remarkable contrast to the growing uncertainty inside the company Ethan had left behind only days before. The second week began with polished optimism inside Whitmore Industrial Solutions, but beneath the carefully prepared presentations and confident speeches, the foundation was beginning to crack in ways that no one could ignore much longer. Ryan Whitmore entered the Monday leadership meeting carrying another stack of colorful reports. "The transition is progressing exactly as planned," he announced. "Once everyone fully adapts, productivity will exceed anything we have achieved before." His words sounded convincing until the first department manager quietly cleared his throat. "We have another issue with the Harrison manufacturing account," he said. Ryan frowned. "What kind of issue?" "Their production schedule has slipped again because approvals are waiting for executive signatures." Ryan folded his arms. "Then they will have to wait. Procedures exist for a reason." The room became silent. Samantha Brooks lowered her eyes toward her notebook, remembering dozens of mornings when Ethan would simply walk across the office, gather the right people together, and resolve the same type of problem before anyone had time to schedule a meeting about it. Back then, urgency had never required permission. It had required responsibility. Later that afternoon, Ryan walked through the operations floor expecting to see employees embracing his new system. Instead, he found people staring at computer screens, waiting for responses that had not arrived. Several supervisors carried folders from one office to another collecting signatures that once had not been necessary. Conversations had become cautious. Decisions had become slower. Even the phone seemed to ring longer before someone answered them. Ryan interpreted the quiet as discipline. In reality, it was uncertainty. Across town, Ethan spent his lunch break sitting on an old wooden bench outside Marcus Bennett's garage with a simple sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Marcus joined him carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You ever think about calling your old company?" Marcus asked. Ethan looked across the busy street where families, delivery trucks, and school buses passed through another ordinary afternoon. "No." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Not even a little?" Ethan smiled gently. "If someone believes they no longer need me, calling them every day will not change their mind. Sometimes people have to discover certain lessons on their own." Marcus laughed softly. "You always did have more patience than the rest of us." Ethan shrugged. "Patience is cheaper than pride." That evening, Lily spread her homework across the kitchen table while Ethan prepared spaghetti for dinner. She looked up from her history worksheet. "Daddy, my teacher said leaders help everyone do their best." Ethan stirred the sauce before answering. "That is a good definition." She smiled. "Then you were probably a really good leader." Ethan paused for only a heartbeat. "I tried to be someone people could trust." Lily nodded with complete confidence, as though no further explanation was necessary. At that same moment, Chairman Charles Whitmore sat alone in his office reviewing another disappointing performance report. Customer satisfaction had declined again. 3 longtime clients had requested meetings with senior leadership instead of routine. Account managers, something that had almost never happened before. More surprising was the pattern emerging from employee feedback surveys. No one directly criticized Ryan, but nearly every anonymous comment repeated the same quiet concern. Decisions took too long. Communication had become difficult. Problems remained unresolved. Charles removed his reading glasses and stared through the windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. He had spent decades building a company that rewarded results. Yet somewhere along the way, he had allowed family loyalty to outweigh careful judgment. He still believed Ryan deserved an opportunity, but for the first time, he wondered whether opportunity had been confused with readiness. As evenings settled across the city, one company struggled beneath growing pressure, while one father quietly helped Lily study for her spelling test, never imagining that the lessons unfolding inside his own home about character, responsibility, and quiet consistency were the very lessons his former workplace was slowly beginning to miss the most. By the beginning of the 3rd week, the warning signs were no longer hidden inside spreadsheets or whispered conversations. They appeared in delayed shipments, unanswered client emails, and conference rooms that stayed occupied long after sunset, without producing real solutions. Every morning, Ryan Whitmore arrived determined to prove that the company simply needed more discipline. Yet each new policy seemed to create another obstacle instead of removing one. "We need additional approval checkpoints," Ryan declared during another executive meeting. "If mistakes are happening, we need tighter oversight." Samantha Brooks finally spoke with careful respect. "Sir, the problem is not that people are making too many decisions. The problem is that they are no longer allowed to make the decisions they already know how to make." Ryan looked at her without responding for several long seconds. "Everyone must follow the process," he answered firmly. The meeting ended exactly as the others had ended, with more instructions but fewer answers. Outside the conference room, department managers returned to their teams carrying new checklists while deadlines continued slipping further away. Across the building, employees quietly began remembering how Ethan had managed the same department. He rarely scheduled unnecessary meetings. He listened before speaking. He trusted experienced people to solve problems. Most importantly, he accepted responsibility whenever something went wrong instead of searching for someone else to blame. His absence had become impossible to ignore because the habits he had quietly built had slowly disappeared after he left. Chairman Charles Whitmore spent that afternoon walking through departments he had not personally visited in months. He stopped beside workstations, greeted employees by name, and noticed something that unsettled him far more than disappointing numbers. The energy had changed. The confident conversations that once filled the office had been replaced by hesitation. Talented employees now waited for instructions instead of offering ideas. Experienced managers second-guessed routine decisions. Even simple questions seemed to require permission from someone higher on the organizational chart. Charles quietly asked one veteran supervisor, "What has changed the most?" The supervisor hesitated before answering honestly. "People used to feel trusted, sir." Those 5 words remained with Charles long after he returned to his office. Meanwhile, Ethan's days continued with remarkable simplicity. Marcus Bennett's garage had become busier as satisfied customers recommended the shop to friends and neighbors. One rainy afternoon, a young mother arrived with 2 children after her vehicle developed engine trouble. She apologized repeatedly because she could not afford an expensive repair. Ethan carefully inspected the car, found that the problem was much smaller than she feared, and repaired it without replacing parts that were still working perfectly. When she thanked him for his honesty, Ethan simply smiled. Everyone deserves a fair chance. Marcus watched from across the garage before quietly shaking his head. "You know, you could have charged a lot more." Ethan closed the hood gently. She needed help, not another problem. That evening, after picking Lily up from school, Ethan attended her elementary school science showcase. Parents filled the gymnasium, while children proudly explained homemade experiments and colorful display boards. Lily introduced Ethan to her teacher with unmistakable pride. "This is my dad. He always fixes things." Ethan laughed softly. "Mostly cars these days." The teacher smiled warmly. "From everything Lily tells us, you fix much more than that." Ethan looked toward his daughter, whose bright smile reflected complete faith in the quiet man standing beside her. At almost that exact moment, Chairman Whitmore opened an archived operations report from only 1 month earlier. As he compared the old performance records with the current ones, a surprising realization slowly settled over him. The company had not been held together by policies alone. It had been held together by someone who understood people as well as processes, and for the first time since making his decision, Charles wondered whether the greatest asset he had ever overlooked had walked out carrying nothing more than a small cardboard box and a framed photograph of his daughter. 3 full weeks had now passed, and the confidence that had surrounded Ryan Whitmore on his first morning had quietly disappeared beneath a growing weight that no expensive office or impressive title could carry alone. Every report arriving on his desk seemed heavier than the last. Client response times had reached record highs. Internal projects had fallen behind schedule. Managers no longer argued with the new procedures because they had become too busy trying to work around them. Early Monday morning, Chairman Charles Whitmore called an unscheduled executive meeting. No polished presentation filled the screen this time. Instead, a single performance dashboard remained projected across the wall, its numbers speaking more honestly than anyone in the room wished to admit. Charles folded his hands before looking around the table. "Explain this to me." No one answered immediately. Ryan finally broke the silence. "The transition has taken longer than expected." Charles nodded slowly. 3 weeks ago, these numbers were stable. Ryan straightened in his chair. Major organizational change always creates temporary disruption. Charles looked toward Helen Foster. "How many long-term clients have contacted us directly during the past 2 weeks?" Helen opened her notebook. 7, sir." Charles continued. "And before this transition?" Helen quietly replied. "None." The room became still. Samantha Brooks glanced toward the empty chair where Ethan had once sat during leadership meetings. No one mentioned his name, yet everyone seemed to be thinking about him. Charles noticed the silence. "Is there something no one is saying?" Samantha hesitated only briefly. "Sir, people trusted the system because they trusted the person leading it." No one challenged her statement. Even Ryan remained silent. That afternoon, Charles requested archived planning documents from previous quarters. As box after box of reports arrived, he began reading through project notes, implementation plans, customer recovery strategies, and internal recommendations. One detail appeared again and again. Ethan's name was almost never displayed in large print. Instead, it appeared quietly in review comments, handwritten notes, process improvements, and operational checklists that had prevented problems long before they became emergencies. Charles slowly realized something uncomfortable. Ethan had never built his reputation by taking credit. He had built it by making everyone else's work easier. Because success had become routine, leadership had gradually stopped noticing the person who quietly created it. Across town, Ethan was helping Marcus install a replacement transmission into an aging delivery van. Sweat covered both men despite the large shop fans turning steadily overhead. Marcus smiled as they lowered the final component into place. "That is another one finished." Ethan tightened the last bolt before stepping back. "Good teamwork." The grateful business owner shook both of their hands before leaving the garage with a smile of relief. Marcus leaned against the workbench afterward. "Funny thing," he said. "Every customer leaves here happier than when they arrived." Ethan laughed softly. "That is usually the goal." Marcus looked directly at him. "No, Ethan. It is because they feel respected." Ethan did not answer. Some compliments were easier to accept in silence than with words. That evening, Lily waited at the kitchen table coloring a poster for school. She looked up as Ethan walked through the front door. "Daddy, our teacher asked us what makes someone successful." Ethan placed a grocery bag on the counter before kneeling beside her. "What did you write?" Lily smiled proudly. "Someone who helps other people even when nobody is watching." Ethan looked at the colorful poster for a long moment before gently brushing a loose strand of hair away from her face. "I think your teacher is going to like that answer." At nearly the same moment, inside a quiet executive office overlooking the Chicago skyline, Charles Whitmore picked up his telephone, stared at it without dialing, and finally admitted to himself what every disappointing report had been trying to teach him for the past 3 weeks. The company had not simply lost an operations director. It had lost the quiet heart that had kept everything working. The following morning, Chairman Charles Whitmore arrived at the office before sunrise, something he had not done in years. The building stood almost silent except for the gentle hum of lights and the distant sound of the cleaning crew finishing their work. He carried a single folder beneath his arm, one filled with handwritten notes he had gathered from department managers throughout the previous evening. None of the pages contained dramatic accusations or emotional complaints. Instead, they shared a remarkably consistent message. Ethan had earned trust because he listened first. Ethan solved problems before they became crises. Ethan never asked who deserved credit. Charles closed the folder and slowly exhaled. For decades, he had believed experience taught a person to recognize leadership. Now he wondered whether familiarity had blinded him to the quietest kind of leadership of all. At 9 o'clock, he called Ryan into his office. Ryan entered carrying another stack of reports. "You wanted to see me?" Charles motioned toward the chair across from his desk. "Sit down." Ryan obeyed without speaking. Charles looked through the large windows overlooking downtown Chicago before finally turning back toward his son. "Tell me honestly, how are things going?" Ryan hesitated. "There have been challenges." Charles nodded. "That is not what I asked." Ryan lowered his eyes for the first time in weeks. "People are not responding the way I expected." Charles remained calm. "Why do you think that is?" Ryan searched for an answer, but found none that felt complete. Finally, he admitted, "I thought having authority would be enough." The chairman remained silent for several seconds before speaking gently. "Authority opens a door. Respect invites people to walk through it." Ryan leaned back quietly, absorbing words that carried far more weight than another performance report ever could. Across town, Ethan was finishing work on an old family station wagon when his phone vibrated inside his pocket. The caller identification displayed a number he had not seen since leaving the company. "Helen Foster." Ethan answered with his usual calm voice. "Good afternoon, Helen." She sounded relieved to hear him. "Hello, Ethan. I hope I am not interrupting." He smiled faintly. "Not at all. What can I do for you?" Helen paused before continuing. "Chairman Whitmore would like to meet with you if you are willing." Ethan looked across the garage where Marcus was helping another customer. "Is something wrong?" Helen answered carefully. "He believes there are some important conversations that should have happened much sooner." Ethan thanked her for the call, but did not immediately give an answer. After ending the conversation, Marcus walked over carrying a toolbox. "Everything all right?" Ethan nodded slowly. "The chairman wants to meet." Marcus grinned knowingly. Looks like reality finally caught up with him. Ethan simply placed his phone back into his pocket. "Maybe." Marcus laughed. "That is all you have to say?" Ethan looked toward the open garage door where sunlight stretched across the concrete floor. People deserve the chance to learn from their decisions. That evening, while helping Lily prepare dinner, she noticed he seemed unusually thoughtful. "Did something interesting happen today?" she asked while setting plates on the table. Ethan smiled. "Someone called to ask if we could have a conversation." Lily tilted her head. "Are you going?" Ethan looked at his daughter before answering. "I have not decided yet." She thought quietly for a moment before offering the simple wisdom only a child could give. If someone wants to say they are sorry, maybe listening is a kind thing to do. Ethan looked at her with quiet admiration. Sometimes the clearest understanding arrived from the smallest voices, and as the evening settled peacefully around their home, he realized that forgiveness often began long before anyone actually asked for it. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock, but Ethan arrived 15 minutes early, just as he always had. Some habits were not created by employment. They were created by character. He parked his aging Ford Escape in the visitor lot instead of the executive parking area he had once been entitled to use, straightened his modest blue dress shirt, and quietly walked through the familiar glass entrance. The receptionist looked up, her eyes widening with surprise before a warm smile spread across her face. "Welcome back, Mr. Walker." Ethan smiled kindly. "Thank you, Emily. It is good to see you." As he crossed the lobby, several employees noticed him. Conversations paused. One by one, people stood from their desks, not because anyone instructed them to, but because respect often reveals itself without ceremony. Samantha Brooks stepped forward first. "It is really good to see you again." Ethan shook her hand warmly. "I hope you have been doing well." She smiled with visible relief. "We have missed you." Similar greetings followed as Ethan continued toward the executive floor. Nobody spoke dramatically. Nobody applauded. Yet the quiet welcome carried more meaning than any formal recognition ever could. Inside the chairman's office, Charles Whitmore stood before the window instead of behind his desk. When Ethan entered, Charles immediately walked forward and extended his hand. "Thank you for coming." Ethan accepted the handshake. "You asked to see me." Charles gestured toward two comfortable chairs, positioned away from the large executive desk. "I think this conversation belongs here instead." They sat facing one another without conference tables or impressive furniture standing between them. After several moments of thoughtful silence, Charles spoke first. "I owe you an apology." Ethan remained quiet, allowing the chairman to continue. "When I placed Ryan into your position, I convinced myself I was investing in the future of this company. What I failed to recognize was that I was replacing experience I had stopped appreciating because it had become dependable." Ethan listened without interruption. Charles lowered his voice. "I confused familiarity with replaceability." The words settled gently into the room. Ethan finally answered. "Every leader makes difficult decisions." Charles slowly shook his head. "Not every leader admits when those decisions were wrong." For the first time in many years, the chairman looked less like the powerful executive whose signature shaped an entire corporation and more like a man honestly confronting his own mistakes. "The company has struggled these past 3 weeks," Charles admitted. "Not because of one person alone, but because I failed to understand what you had quietly built." Ethan looked toward the city skyline before speaking. "Systems matter, but people make systems work." Charles nodded immediately. "Exactly." He leaned forward slightly. "I would like you to come back." Ethan did not respond right away. Instead, he thoughtfully folded his hands together. "If I returned, it could not simply be to restore old routines." Charles waited patiently. What would need to change? Ethan met the chairman's eyes with calm confidence. "Leadership must be based on trust, not titles. Experienced people need freedom to solve problems. Good ideas should matter more than family names. And every employee deserves to know that character will always outweigh connections." Charles listened carefully, never interrupting once. When Ethan finished, the chairman quietly smiled. "Everything you just described is exactly what this company has been missing." Outside the office, Ryan stood unnoticed near the hallway after arriving early for his own scheduled meeting. Through the partially open doorway, he could hear only fragments of the conversation, but those few honest words were enough to reveal something he had not fully understood until that moment. Respect had never belonged to a position. It had always belonged to the person who quietly earned it every single day. Ryan remained in the hallway long after Ethan and Chairman Charles Whitmore finished speaking. He quietly stepped away before either man opened the office door, not because he wished to avoid responsibility, but because he suddenly understood that some lessons had to settle into the heart before they could ever be spoken aloud. A few minutes later, Charles invited him back inside. The room felt different now. No one stood behind a desk. No one spoke from a position of authority. 3 men simply faced one another with honesty replacing titles. Charles broke the silence first. "Ryan, there is something I should have taught you long before I gave you a leadership position." Ryan nodded slowly. "You should earn it before you receive it." Charles looked at his son with quiet pride. "Yes." Ryan turned toward Ethan. For several seconds, he searched for the right words, knowing there was no sentence capable of undoing the previous 3 weeks. Finally, he spoke with complete sincerity. "I believe the position made me a leader. I understand now that leadership is something people choose to give you." Ethan offered a gentle smile. "That realization is where real leadership begins." Ryan lowered his eyes. "I am sorry." Ethan accepted the apology without hesitation. "Thank you." The moment contained no dramatic speeches, no applause, and no celebration. Only 3 people choosing humility instead of pride. Charles then looked toward Ethan once more. "My offer still stands, but I want to be very clear. I am not asking you to rescue the company because we failed. I am asking you to help us build the kind of company we should have been all along." Ethan thought quietly before answering. "Then I will return on one condition." Charles smiled faintly. "Name it." Ethan glanced briefly toward Ryan before speaking. "We build leaders instead of successors. Every employee deserves the opportunity to grow through merit, preparation, and character." Charles extended his hand immediately. "Agreed." Ryan nodded with genuine respect. "Agreed." The following Monday morning, employees gathered once again inside the familiar conference room overlooking the Chicago skyline. This time the atmosphere felt entirely different. Charles stood before the team with Ethan beside him and Ryan seated among the department leaders rather than at the head of the table. Today, Charles began, we are correcting more than an organizational decision. We are correcting a leadership mistake. Effective immediately, Ethan Walker will return as Director of Strategic Operations, and together we will begin rebuilding a culture where trust, experience, and integrity guide every decision we make. The room remained silent for only a heartbeat before warm applause filled the conference room. Samantha smiled openly. Managers exchanged relieved glances. Even employees who had joined the company only recently found themselves applauding because genuine respect has a way of becoming visible to everyone. Ethan waited patiently until the applause faded. Thank you, he said calmly. I am not here because I was right. I am here because this company is filled with good people who deserve to succeed together. Let us move forward without resentment and without pride. Let us simply do good work and help one another. As the meeting ended, people returned to their desks with lighter steps than they had carried in weeks. That evening, Ethan drove home beneath the golden light of another Chicago sunset. Lily ran across the front yard the moment his Ford Escape pulled into the driveway. How was your day, Daddy? She asked with an eager smile. Ethan knelt beside her and gently hugged her. It reminded me that kindness never loses its value, even when people forget to recognize it for a little while. Lily slipped her small hand into his as they walked toward the front door together. Inside that modest home, surrounded by nothing extraordinary except love, honesty, and quiet dignity, Ethan possessed the one success no title could ever grant and no position could ever take away.